I'm Mo Markham with Liberation Hour Radio, and we are very pleased to bring you Dr. Sarah Dodd today. And I will introduce her in a moment, but you can find us on Facebook at Liberation Hour Radio and on YouTube. Hello, Sarah, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Mo. It's great to be here virtually.
Yeah, everything is still virtual right now with the pandemic, but we appreciate your coming. Dr. Sarah Dodd is a vegan vet. She specializes in canine and feline nutrition. Her work is geared toward understanding how vegans can feed the animals in their care without relying on the animal agriculture industry. Plant-based diets are her particular area of research, and she enjoys teaching clients and students about pros and cons of unconventional diets for cats and dogs. Sarah is originally from Hamilton, Ontario, and she studied overseas in England and Scotland before attaining her veterinary degree at Massey University in New Zealand. After graduation, Dr. Dodd completed a specialty nutrition internship and a Master of Science degree at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. She is a Ph.D. candidate, and she is also working towards her board certification as a veterinary nutritionist with the European College of Veterinary and Comparative Nutrition. Thank you very much for joining us, Sarah. It's amazing to have a vegan vet among us.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
Thank you. And it is so strange to have vets who aren't vegan, but it's fabulous to have some who are. Can you talk to us a little bit? I'm going to ask you about your studies, about the research that you've been doing, et cetera. But I wonder if you could just tell our listeners what a carnivore is, and if humans are carnivores, cats are carnivores, et cetera, and just start there.
Sure. So carnivore is a taxonomic name, I guess, that's given. So you have the order Carnivora, and that includes a number of different species. So we have felines, including our domestic cats. There are also some other kind of more omnivorous animals that are still classified under order Carnivora. So you have your raccoons, and you also have strict herbivores, such as pandas, who are actually under order Carnivora, but their diet is completely plant-based. So carnivore is just a word that is used and is applied to the animals under order Carnivora, although we often hear the term obligate carnivore when people are talking about nutritional requirements. And so although I don't deal with humans, that's a little bit outside of my species scope, but I can tell you we're certainly not herbivores, or sorry, we're not carnivores. When we're looking at, for example, cats, we call them obligate carnivores because they have strict nutritional requirements, which means that they need to intake a number of more nutrients than, say, omnivores who have quite flexible nutritional requirements.
Awesome. So we know that cats are carnivores. So the million-dollar question is, can cats be plant-based as well?
So when we talk about what it is to be a carnivore and an obligate carnivore, it means that they have these particular nutritional requirements. It doesn't actually mean that they need meat or animal tissues. It means that they need the nutrients that would usually be obtained from those. So in nature, in the wild, if you want, these animals would be getting their nutrients from animal tissues, absolutely. But we can replicate that nutritional profile without actually using animal-derived ingredients. We can use plant-based ingredients. We can use like inorganic minerals. We can even add in synthetic amino acids to actually make a diet that contains all of these nutrients without having any animal tissues in them.
So some of those nutrients that you're talking about, the one thing that people are always talking about is taurine. Can you talk about that a little bit, and how a cat can have a plant-based diet that includes taurine?
Yeah, so taurine traditionally would be derived from animal tissues. So that's where we used to see taurine coming into industrialized pet food. But it was actually determined, I believe, in the late 80s or early 90s, that some cats were suffering from taurine deficiency when they were fed a canned food that was made with meat. I mean, they were pretty much all made with meat back then. And yet the animals were becoming taurine deficient, and it was because of the heat processing. So during the cooking of the canned food, the taurine, which is quite a heat sensitive amino acid, was not available to the cats after processing, and so they were becoming taurine deficient. And it was from that that they discovered that this addition of synthetic taurine, in addition to the taurine that was coming in from the animal products that were naturally in the diet, could actually reverse that taurine deficiency. And that's when we started seeing supplementation with synthetic taurine throughout the industry. And so now pick up any bag of cat food that you find, and it'll often include taurine in the list of ingredients. And that's an added taurine. It's a synthetic taurine that is added to meet the nutritional requirements of the cat and account for the losses that might occur from taurine that's naturally coming in from the animal tissues. That's the same synthetic taurine that we can put into plant-based foods, and it meets their nutritional requirements in exactly the same manner.
Awesome. So all cats essentially, if they're eating commercial diets right now, are receiving synthetic taurine. Is that correct?
Predominantly, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. And you know, to be upfront, of course, as you know, I have 5 vegan cats of my own. So I'm that's why I'm really happy to be talking to you today and sharing some of that information with the world too. You know, because so many people still believe that it isn't possible to have cats on plant-based diets. I will ask you about some of your research in that area in a minute, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about dogs being plant-based as well, since we're
So dogs, they also fall into that order Carnivora, but they are not in the same family as the cats. And so dogs are much more what we call facultative carnivores, as opposed to obligate carnivores. So the dog's predecessor that we see, either if you want to trace it back to the wild wolf, or if you want to look at feral dog populations around the world, they often have a diet that is very rich in animal tissues because they are nutrient dense and energy dense. And when you're feeding and fasting and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, that is a good way to replenish your stored energy. But when times are scarce, and in certain geographical regions as well, we can see different species of wolves, and again, alluding to these feral dogs, who have a diet that's very varied. And especially with feral dog populations, you'll often see them in close association with human habitation, and they're feeding from a lot of refuse from humans. And again, that can be very heavy in the plant materials as well. And so they're much more flexible naturally in what they're able to eat. They have much less rigorous requirements than cats. They're not as flexible, say, as humans, but they're not as strict in their requirements as cats. And so it's a lot easier to meet all of their nutritional requirements with plants.
I know that you've done some research recently. Well, maybe you can talk about your most recent research on cats, on studying cats on plant-based diets compared to cats on carnivore diets.
Yeah, so we recently released a publication in the BMC Veterinary Research, and it was a survey-based study looking at populations of cats fed either plant-based or conventional animal-based diets. And what we were going into this thinking was that we would find that people were reporting, for example, urinary tract infections. That's something that has been previously hypothesized that cats fed plant-based diets would be at increased risk of because of the potential for the alkalinizing effect of the diet. So we expected we were going to find things like maybe increased rates of urinary tract diseases or whatever. And we actually didn't find that. Indeed, we found that there was really no adverse health outcome that was being reported more commonly in cats fed plant-based. And actually, there were some conditions that were being reported less frequently among the plant-based population. So that was a intriguing and unexpected finding. And then we looked back at cats that the people had previously kept and had passed on, and we were looking to see if there was a difference in the age of the cats. And admittedly, this was a retrospective study. People were thinking back in time to animals that they'd had previously. We don't know how long the cats had been fed a plant-based diet. They were just categorized as plant-based or conventional based on what they had the person reported feeding them, and yet we didn't find any differences at all there.
And I didn't realize it was actual in urinary infections. I thought that it was more likely, or that there has been talk that it's more likely that cats on plant-based diets are more likely to have crystals, particularly if they aren't getting enough water in their diet.
Yeah. That's certainly more typically the presentation. One of the concerns being when we see marked crystalluria and we see bladder inflammation like that, that can also predispose to secondary infection. But yeah, I guess feline lower urinary tract diseases in general, as opposed to infections, you would expect if we are seeing an alkalinizing effect of the diet and it was affecting the urine pH, that you would expect to see more problems there. But we didn't have any evidence for that. Considering, if we look back to my publication a couple of years ago when we were looking at the proportion of dogs and cats that were fed plant-based diets, around 1% of companion cats were being fed plant-based diets. And so if we're thinking about there being millions of cats, just look at North America, if 1% of those are fed a plant-based diet, that's still a large number of animals we're talking about, right? We're not talking about a couple hundred cats. Like there's large numbers of cats, and so it's interesting that there haven't been any more case reports. I mean, we've seen lots of case reports of cats and dogs on any given diet with adverse health outcomes. So it's interesting that we haven't seen any more with the plant-based diets yet. Certainly we see that there are a lot of, especially dogs, that have dietary hypersensitivities and allergies to those common protein sources that are used so ubiquitously within kind of the pet food industry. So we can certainly see some adverse reactions there that improve. I mean, we have a couple of veterinary therapeutic diets that are almost entirely plant-based, and they're used particularly for dietary hypersensitivities, or we'll use them if we have hyperlipidemia, or they can be really great for animals with liver compromise as well, because they have a nicer, gentler amino acid profile for those animals. So there are the therapeutic effects, and there are some instances where we actually, for therapeutic reasons, want the animal to be on a plant-based diet.
Cool. We are going to take a quick break right here, and we will come back in a few minutes. Thank you so much. I'm talking to Dr. Sarah Dodd, who is a veterinarian at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph, about plant-based diets for cats and dogs. Hi, I'm Mo Markham, and I'm here on Liberation Hour Radio, and I have Dr. Sarah Dodd, a vegan vet who works at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. And Dr. Sarah Dodd is speaking to us today about vegan diets for cats and dogs. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us yet again.
Thanks.
Or still. Can you tell us a little bit about kittens and puppies on plant-based diets? I know there are fewer choices out there in terms of foods, but can you talk to that? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so in terms of the diets, at least in Canada, that are commercially available, we don't have all that many that are specifically formulated for growth and development. So there is one food that's imported from Europe that has a claim for puppy development. And then there are a handful of diets that have claims for being all life stages. So when a diet says on the label that it's for all life stages, that actually means that it's formulated for puppy or kitten development, because that's the strictest requirements. And so for some adult animals, that is perfectly fine. For some, it might be a little bit too rich in energy or fat, because it is made for the development of puppies and kittens. But there are a handful, at least, of commercial available diets out there. It is a lot more challenging to formulate a diet for puppy or kitten growth because they just have even more kind of strict nutritional requirements. So they have a higher requirement, say, for protein, because I mean, their body is depositing protein as they grow. That's what their muscle and their tissues are all made from. They also have higher requirements and a more stricter kind of ratio for calcium and phosphorus, because of course their skeletons are growing as well. So those are things to consider. The other thing with puppies and kittens, having those increased nutritional requirements, because they are growing so rapidly and they're so metabolically active, is that when things go wrong, they go wrong much quicker and much more dramatically. So always worth keeping a very close eye on nutrition of puppies and kittens to make sure that they are growing at an appropriate manner. They're not kind of jumping up in their growth and then lagging, or they're not growing too slowly, and making sure that everything's going well with them.
Sounds good. I have 5 cats myself who are about 4 years old. So this is a subject that's very dear to my heart. And one of the reasons that I decided to have my cats plant-based, well, a couple of reasons. Obviously, because of the animals, it didn't make sense to me to kill all of these animals, or to pay for all these animals to be killed to feed my cats. And I've also seen, firsthand in the industry how these animals are treated in slaughterhouses, and I have been on factory farms as well, and the conditions that they live in. And then when I look at my cats living the life of Riley, I had a difficult time with that, with imagining all of those animals dying and living those tortured lives in order to feed my cats, when there are alternatives now. But I know and the rest of the world might not know, but in addition to working with cats and dogs in the small animal clinic at the Ontario Veterinary College, you also work on sanctuaries and work with the sanctuary animals. Can you tell us a bit about that work that you do, Sarah?
Yeah, doing a PhD and a residency together wasn't enough work. So I started Dodd Veterinary Services, which is a mobile service. So I go to sanctuaries and to rescues. So I work with companion animals as well with Dodd Vet Services. So it's a service for rescues and sanctuaries. Really, it's my kind of attempt to give back to the community. I have the utmost respect for everyone who's working in the sanctuary movement. I think that it is an incredible form of animal activism, and it's the best way. I mean, the only skills that I have, I've worked my whole life towards being a veterinarian, and it's really all I know is animal health care. And so being able to help support sanctuaries, help educate educate people as well. I kind of see my role not only going and working, for example, like today, going out and dealing with things as they come up, but is also working with people to implement kind of better healthcare management and preventative healthcare. And I take kind of the approach of looking at every animal as an individual that you see in companion animal medicine, where you see every single dog and cat comes into the examination room. They're looked at as an individual. You collect the history on them. You perform a physical exam. They have a tailored plan that's specifically for them. Whereas a lot of times when we look at food producing animals, we're looking at herd health, which is incredibly important, but the individuals can sometimes get lost. So you lose the forest for the trees, right? And so when you take kind of an individualized approach, it takes a lot longer, but you can actually see every animal as an individual. And especially when you're talking about the scale on sanctuaries, we're not usually looking at a herd of a few hundred cattle, or we're not looking at a poultry house with a few thousand birds. We're looking at a few animals who are living as individuals with very independent requirements and needs, and so being able to look at them that way. And that's what I try to kind of provide with my services for sanctuaries, is to kind of bring that individuality of healthcare and apply it to species that might not otherwise always kind of get that consideration.
And even get veterinary care. I know from Tamara at the Browns Micro Sanctuary, and sometimes when she has been looking for veterinary care for her chickens, that there are very few vets who will actually see a chicken who is a companion animal. They will not treat a chicken because they don't know how, right? Because who would spend hundreds of dollars treating a chicken's ailments on a farm that's on a commercial farm. It's amazing to go to a sanctuary and see animals and look them in the eye, and I think it's very powerful and helps us to think about them, as you say, as individuals, and to think about their right to be here, their right to have a life the same as the animals that we normally share our lives with and our homes with, cats and dogs. The other reason that made me, in fact, the reason that I started on my vegan journey was around climate, and I still do a lot of climate work. And I understand you've probably seen it as well. There's a study from Oken at the University of California, who talks about cats and dogs. If they were a country, they would be the 5th largest country in the world, meat-eating country in the world. Just the cats and dogs in the United States alone is what he was looking at. That's the numbers he was looking at. So from an environmental perspective as well, feeding a cat or a dog a plant-based diet is important, as well as obviously the lives and the suffering of all of the other animals. I know that plant-based foods are easily available for dogs. You can actually go into a pet store and buy plant-based dog food, but you can't buy plant-based cat food. Can you talk about that a little bit, Sarah?
Yeah, so the way I try to conceptualize that is that what we see in this particular niche in the industry is that we have vegan companies and we have pet food companies making plant-based products. So for example, in the pet store, you can go in and you can see Natural Balance, you can see Halo, you can see Pet Curie and Gather, and they have these plant-based options in among the other products in the line. So they're your pet food companies that are producing plant-based options for dogs, and those are available in brick and mortar stores, and they're relatively easy to find. Their price point is comparable to other kind of premium diets that you'll find on the same shelf, and produced by those particular companies. When you look at the other kind of flip side to that, is there are these vegan companies whose entire philosophy revolves around their veganism, and they're producing plant-based pet foods, and that's their exclusive production. They're not making other pet foods. They're just making plant-based pet food. And they're not found ubiquitously in pet stores. They are probably much smaller companies. They're very niche. And a lot of times they're either direct to consumer or they're going through specialty distributors. And so what we're seeing there is particularly with the cats, there haven't been any pet food companies that have come out yet with a commercially available plant-based diet. Whether the demand in the market is just too small for them to invest in development of that product, whether it doesn't fit with their kind of company philosophy, whatever the reason being, we're currently limited to just that kind of handful of vegan companies that are making the plant-based cat foods. And so that's much harder to come by. And, I know particularly here in Ontario and Canada, there's a couple of distributors that you can acquire them from, but it's usually an online kind of retailer.
Right. And that's how I get mine as well. And sometimes at Veg Fest and things, when that's the thing again, hopefully soon. Hopefully this year we'll end up with some Veg Fests. Everything was canceled last year, but it's something to look forward to. Wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to share with us, Sarah.
Yeah, if I may kind of take a kind of soapbox moment here for a second, and that would be, I want to encourage anyone who is either currently feeding or thinking about feeding a plant-based diet to their companion animal, to please, when you have conversations with your veterinarian, be open and honest with your veterinarian about what you're feeding. And like you said, Mo, they may pin everything immediately on the diet because it's ingrained in us when you have something abnormal, that's there, it's a problems-based approach, and you're like, okay, here's a problem, I can work with that. It might not necessarily be the root of what you're seeing the animal presented for, but it's something you can go on when you don't necessarily have other leads. But I really do encourage that kind of open and honest dialogue with your veterinarian, because not having the full picture really hinders your veterinarian's ability to help you help the animal that is in your care. So that's the one kind of reason. The other reason being that if this becomes something that people are more familiar with, people are more comfortable talking about, veterinarians are seeing more, that can also help us understand better exactly what proportion, say, of the animals that are coming through our clinic doors, and say, okay, we know that in this clinic, in this geographical area, this is the kind of prevalence. And it can really help with building that understanding of what is the health status of these animals like, what are problems that are or are not arising, and can help really give us confidence in going forward and seeing how many animals are actually being maintained on plant-based diets, and how healthy they are for how long. So that's kind of my soapboxes. And if things go awry, if you're not feeling comfortable having those kind of conversations with your veterinarian, maybe that's a conversation that you need to have with your vet about, being able to be open and honest with them, and whether it's a concern for judgment, or a fear of being told something you don't want to hear from them. I think that's something that needs to be talked about as well, because at the end of the day, I think predominantly veterinarians are in practice because they actually want to be working with you and not working against you. And so together we can kind of team up and we can make sure that we're doing what's best for every animal out there.
Awesome. And I think it isn't, a place for medical advice, but there are a number of groups on Facebook, and I don't know, I'm not on other platforms, but there are a number of groups for that. Well, they're not actually for the vegan cats, they're for the guardians, of course, and for vegan cats and dogs, and for dogs. And I'm in a group for vegan cats, And there are more than 9,000 people there. So it's a good place to go and to bounce things off of and ask questions. There's a files section, so there's information, there's studies that have been done in the files section and information there. So it's helpful to be able to just bounce things off other people who are feeding vegan diets, because there aren't a ton of us. So that can be helpful. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you as well, Sarah, was about homemade diets for cats. I know there are supplements that are used. I have used them myself in the past with recipes that come with them. And I just wanted you to speak to that a little bit, if you could.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing a lot more movement towards feeding homemade and some sort of like fresh type foods. I think that a lot of that is coming with this more adoption of cats and other companion animals as being, family members that we're trying to take care of. And we see that trends in the way we feed ourselves are really shadowed in the way that we feed our canine and feline companions. And so a part of that is that kind of homemade or fresh type trend. And so it's something that we do see some problems with. A lot of the diets or the diet formulations that we can find out there, they're not actually complete and balanced by and large. There's been a few studies that have demonstrated some real issues with those diets. And so what we recommend is that if people were to pursue a homemade diet, that they would do so with the assistance of a veterinary nutritionist to make sure that they are feeding all of those essential nutrients that their cat or dog requires. It certainly can be done, but it's particularly challenging. And one part of it is that it's all well and good to have a recipe on paper. It's hard enough to get a recipe on paper that is complete and balanced. But then we also need to make something that's palatable and that the cat or the dog are going to want to eat. And so that can take quite a few iterations. So if you're limited to a single recipe that's provided with a supplement and your companion's not actually consuming it that way, if you start making some adaptations and some switching of ingredients to try and get something that they're going to like, that can completely throw out that nutrient balance. And so working with a veterinary nutritionist is the best way to make sure that you are getting all of those essential nutrients delivered in every meal.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan. One of the things that people often talk about with a plant-based diet for cats is having an acidifier.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about that quite a bit in the Vegan Cats group. Can you talk about that a bit yourself?
Yeah, so that came around from an idea that a plant-based diet is potentially alkalinizing. So we see that in human nutrition, at least, a whole foods plant-based diet is promoted as being more alkalinizing than what you call the SAD or the standard American diet, which can be quite acidifying. And so there are lots of papers that have looked at potential health benefits for humans of having a whole foods plant-based alkalinizing type diet. We don't see that same translate over to cats and dogs. Cats, being the obligate carnivores that we talked about earlier, they actually naturally have a more acidic pH and they produce more acidic urine in particular. And so there's this idea that potentially we could be predisposing cats to some problems if they are not getting some acidifying ingredients or acidifying nutrients coming in with that diet. There actually hasn't been any case reports or case series or studies that have demonstrated that a plant-based diet is alkalinizing in any individual cat, as in we haven't seen like a before and after kind of effect where urine pH was X, cats were fed a plant-based diet, and then urine pH was Y. But we're all kind of working on this assumption, I guess, that that's something that could happen. And so there are acidifying ingredients and there are individual acidifying nutrients that can be added to either a commercial diet or to a homemade diet that can alter the pH of the urine that is produced. And so what I would recommend before going ahead and adding anything like that into the diet would be to monitor pH, see what the pH of the urine is currently, see if it's in that normal level or whether it's too alkaline. And then if required, you can titrate to effect and add in a urinary acidifier or add in a couple different urinary acidifiers so that you're not kind of topping out on one particular nutrient or ingredient. And you can work with that in that way.
Okay, and testing pH, sometimes I've heard people say that, oh, they can't afford to feed their cats a plant-based diet because they need to get blood tests all the time, but you can test pH at home with pH strips. Is that correct?
Yeah, so certainly going to the veterinarian and getting routine blood work. I mean, that's something that we would recommend for every animal on a regular basis.
Right.
But you're not actually going to see changes in blood work all that quickly that would be associated with nutritional status. The routine blood work that we do at vet clinics is, your complete blood count, where you're looking at the number of red blood cells. And certainly if you had issues with potentially iron or folate or B12, you might see some issues with anemia popping up there, or a serum biochemistry. And serum biochemistry is a marker of organ function for the most part. So unless you actually have any sort of deficiencies that are strongly affecting a particular organ system, you're not really going to see any differences there. So what we would recommend instead, like you said with the urine pH strips, would be to just monitor that if there's concerns about that, and either going to your regular family veterinarian and having a full urinalysis done. That should certainly be done on a regular basis for any cat. But in between those routine appointments, you can also be monitoring at home. So you can either use a pH monitoring, like an indicator strip, or I know there are even some kitty litters now that change color depending on the urine pH of the cat. So something that can be monitored at home, and certainly can be used to kind of keep an eye and watch for problems.
I've heard that those don't always work, but
nothing always works.
Yeah, fair enough. So as vegans, one of the things that we talk about is trying to cause as little harm as possible. And, for me, what that means is being able to feed my cats a diet that I feel comfortable with. And so what you're telling us is basically that cats can survive on a plant-based diet, and they can thrive as well, many of them.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, you don't need to listen to me about that. There are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands around the world of cats who have been eating plant-based diets for years. And so that's anecdote, but certainly that's been occurring. And yeah, it's a relatively new phenomenon, but by relatively new, I mean it's cropped up in the past couple of decades. So there is some historical anecdote for the fact that certainly cats can live on a plant-based diet. But the next part that you mentioned there, thriving, that's probably the part that people discuss the most about. And so I think that you're not alone in the way that you feel. Rothgerber, a researcher in the kind of psychology field, I guess, looking at particularly around human and animal relationships. And they published a couple of studies that looked at the guilt that pet parents were feeling. And they actually called it a moral dilemma and a conundrum that people face when they're taking animals in, providing care and a home environment for them, and yet then having to feed those animals products that contain other animals. And it's a little bit of mental gymnastics for some people to try and kind of reconcile those two. And so looking in populations of vegans and vegetarians, he found that there was a large amount of guilt that people were feeling associated with feeding an animal-based diet to animals in their house. So you're absolutely not alone in feeling that way. And what we can say is there's plenty of cats that are out there who are eating plant-based diets. We don't have really much in the way of data to demonstrate any adverse effect or to predict what sort of problems we might run into. That was one of the things that we expected to come from this study, was something that might show us an area that we could then focus some research on. But we came up empty-handed there. There wasn't any particular problem that is being encountered by cats fed plant-based diets, at least not that anybody was fessing up to.
Right. So so those of us who want to feed our cats a plant-based diet and feel like we're living our values, I think thinking about the other animals involved and how many other animals are involved if we are feeding them animals is important. And one of the things that people have said to me is, you should adopt a rabbit, or an animal that doesn't that isn't a carnivore. And my response to that is, well, if I didn't adopt these cats, where would they be, right? So it's not like I'm not buying an animal. I'm adopting an animal who needs a home, right? So, and if I didn't adopt them, someone else might have who would feed them other animals. So for me, it feels most comfortable to feed them a plant-based diet. And I'm happy to hear that your research has shown that it can be done, that people think it can be done. And certainly, in the group that I'm in on Facebook, there are 9,000 people in that group with one or more cats on a plant-based diet. So it's good to talk to other people who are feeding their cats plant-based, and to find out how it goes for them. And they have pictures of all of their cats and how old they are. Some of them 15 and 20 years old on plant-based diets. So that's always good to see.
And I know, that's obviously that's anecdote, but the fact that groups and populations like that exist, I mean, there are people out there who genuinely have a notion that cats cannot live without animal products, and that simply isn't true. And I think, like I'd said before, the whole concept of thriving or what is optimal, I mean, you can certainly argue that back and forth for a very long time. We don't have any objective measurements of what optimal or what thriving is. It's kind of a concept or an idea. So that's something that certainly could be kind of thought about, and are there things that we could do differently or we could do better? I mean, that's something we're always exploring, but to say that it can't be done and that cats can't live on a plant-based diet, that just is simply not true.
I can swear that it isn't, because I have 5 of them and they are all nearly 4 years old. So and I like to say to people, that's about 3 or more years older than most farm animals get to live. Another question, Sarah, is, what's it like for you in the community that you work in with other veterinarians? Has there been pushback? I know you have students at the university that you're working with. Has there been pushback from the community in general towards you for looking at plant-based diets for cats and dogs?
I'd cautiously say a little bit, but I'll preface it with, it's, for the most part, especially from within the veterinary field, it has all been very collegiate for the most part. And I think anytime that you're working in something that is kind of a little bit fringe or novel or new or out there, you're always going to have people who are kind of questioning your motives or questioning what you're up to. But I think one really strong advantage that I have is that my research supervisor, who I'm working under, Dr. Adroni Verbrugge, she has spent her entire career pretty much researching the carnivorous physiology of the feline animal. And her research has all been based around what the peculiarities are of an obligate carnivore. And so clearly we come from kind of very different ends of the spectrum. And I think that really helps lend credibility to the work that we're doing, because we have someone working with us who has a wealth of experience in that field, in particular with that focus on the obligate carnivore or obligatorily carnivorous nature of cats. So that's, I think, been a really good partnership for me. And certainly, like I say, it's been mostly collegiate. There's definitely people out there, veterinarians included, who would say that this is maybe ethically not appropriate to be looking into. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think sometimes people don't always read entire articles. I think a lot of times people read titles, maybe they'll read an abstract, and especially when it starts to get out into the media. And always, whenever I publish something, again, that's a little bit out there, it winds up garnering a lot of media attention. It's a very emotive topic for a lot of people. I mean, I think just looking at food in and of itself, it's such a strong focus for many people's identity. It has cultural associations, it has societal associations, there are family traditions. And then when you look at particularly individuals like vegans who have what people often think of as being a strong association with food, it's not. It's an idea of a lifestyle, and avoidance of animal products in food is one component of it. But anytime you have something that's so emotionally linked with someone's personal identity, I think there's always going to be people on opposite ends of the spectrum and everywhere in between. And so you certainly do get some interesting conversations, but at least within the profession, people are generally at least polite to my face and in writing. But I mean, it's research, it's work where we're looking at questions, we're looking for answers. And I don't think that that's something that anybody can really fault you for. We're looking to see what's going on out there. We're looking to see what cats' health are like. We're looking at nutrient levels in food. We're not, trying to sell anything to anyone. We're just trying to look at what's going on and make some more research projects from it as well. So
I know in the past you've been doing some fundraising for equipment for your sanctuary visits, which I believe are pro bono, that you're just charging people for the medications and for your costs. And I'm wondering if you're still raising money for equipment at this time, or?
thanks for asking. But actually, we had kind of a great kind of community-driven kind of funding. So I actually acquired a lot of new equipment this year, and Dodd Veterinary Services has pretty much everything that I can possibly use solo. So actually a huge thank you to a couple of my sanctuary clients as well, really helped out with that. So it was fantastic. I don't know if I can name them here, but between Brown's Micro Sanctuary. So you said about tomorrow already. So Brown's Micro Sanctuary was amazing, and Tamara continues to find things to help me with. So she gets things from human clinics and donates materials and stuff, and she was really helpful with fundraising. And Karuna Lane Farm Sanctuary, incredible effort. So I'd love to encourage everybody here, if you're in Ontario or not, give those guys some love. They're both really wonderful people. They're small sanctuaries, really run kind of by one individual each, so they could really use some love. And they both have chickens, and chickens are the most expensive animals. You wouldn't believe it, but yeah, I'm visiting both of them pretty frequently. So any love that you can send their way would be really appreciated.
For sure. Two of our favorites, and Leonard has decided to come and pay a visit as well. And now, of course, now that the camera is on him, he's gonna escape. So vegan cat 1. We have 4 more. I think that I'm just wondering if there's anything else. I know that people often ask if they can see you, and I think that I'll just tell people so they don't go searching for you and get disappointed that you actually work at the Veterinary College, which is a teaching college, and you don't have a practice seeing cats and dogs of your own, or a practice of your own seeing cats and dogs. But sometimes if people are bringing sick animals to the Ontario Veterinary College and they need nutritional advice, then you do see them there. So I know that's disappointing for people, and and we love it that you're doing research, but it's hard knowing that there's a vegan vet around and not being able to access them directly. But there are some other vegan vets, and that's a question that people can ask, certainly in a vegan pet, a vegan cat or dog group, to ask if there are vegan vets in your area. And you know, I have to say for myself, it's fabulous to be able to feed my cats a vegan diet and feel like I'm you know, living my values that way, and knowing that I'm able to, that I don't have to cause suffering to other animals to feed them. So I really love doing that. And I'm grateful to people like you who are doing research in these areas and helping people to understand that it is possible to do this. It is possible to do this for all of the animals. And I really appreciate your work. And I thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah. And I hope to see you again when you've got some more research out, and maybe we can talk again.
That would be great. I'd really love that. Thank you, Mo.
Thank you. So we are Liberation Hour Radio. You can find us on Facebook and on YouTube. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Cheers.
So, thank you.